So now I have the privilege of introducing two wonderful colleagues of IJOH's, Dr. Jayne Malenfant and Rob Robinson. So Rob and I met through some of the work that we do at the United Nations and have just continued to stay in touch with him. And he's been a wonderful partner and advisor to IJOH. And Dr. Malenfant, I forgot to bring your bio up here. So I'm going to have you introduce yourself to our colleagues here, and I'm going to figure out also how to get your slides up. You know how? Maybe. Yeah, brilliant.
Is it shared?
Yep.
I was very confident that I knew how to do that. There? How long have we been doing stuff on Zoom? And great. Cool. I'm gonna time myself because I can talk a lot now. Hi everyone, how are you doing?
Good.
That was pretty good. High energy. Yeah, so my name is Jayne Malenfant. I'm from Kapuskasing, Ontario, which is Treaty 9 territory up in Canada, about a 16-hour drive north-ish of here. But right now I live and work in Tiohtià:ke, in Kanien'kehá:ka, Mooniang, and Anishinaabemowin, or Montreal in Quebec, Canada. I am a McGill 3rd Century Fellow at McGill University, where I do research on homelessness. And so today I'm going to start us off with some things that I've been learning doing research with people who have lived experience of homelessness, who are working in research and advocacy spaces, and what I've been learning from them. And then hopefully we'll have a dialogue about that. So in this project, I've been exploring how communities who are most impacted by housing injustice can be leaders in sustainably building housing justice movements. And in many ways, talking with people with lived experience, this might not be a huge surprise to some of you. There are a lot of incredible experts who are working in their communities to lead change, who are ensuring that the things that happen to them do not happen to their community members. What I've also been finding, however, is that as researchers and as organizations, we're not always supporting people with lived experience to be doing that work in a sustainable way. Intentionally or not, I speak as a researcher and someone with lived experience, we repeatedly undervalue, objectify, and tokenize people with lived experience and community knowledges. Sometimes we do significant harm trying to do research that honors community knowledges, whether we want to or not. Nope. Okay, so I'm going to share some things that I've been learning from other lived experts about how to do this work well, and how we can enter into this work. The first thing I keep hearing again and again is that we shouldn't be beginning our work with a question of whether or not lived knowledges are valuable to shaping our responses to homelessness. They are absolutely invaluable to understanding how systems work, or more often don't work for people. And so when I talk to lived experts, I hear again and again, inclusion is a starting point, but it's not the end point. Inclusion is not enough. Having a seat at the table is not enough. Actually changing the way that the table is structured should be the end goal. It's a starting point, and it's an important starting point, but I hear again and again, it doesn't matter if I'm at the table if the table is still harmful to me. Truly integrating and supporting community knowledges as one aspect of expertise is important not from an equity or inclusion standpoint, it's important from a justice standpoint. And it's important because it gives us information that we otherwise don't have about how systems are organized. So one thing that I look at is what people are already doing in spite of systems that harm them to survive and take care of each other. We know what happens when people make decisions on our behalf, especially make decisions on our behalf without the knowledges that we hold in our communities. Research, which I realize we all have very different relationships to in this room, has a long history of extracting from, erasing, and distorting the realities of people who are homeless, who are displaced, and who are colonized. So I really want us to think this week about how we can find different ways of honoring community knowledges in research and advocacy work. Again, I want to reiterate that people with lived experience know often over and over and have to tell their stories over and over about what isn't working here and across the globe. They need support. I've heard this again and again. I need support, I need training, I need allies to stand up and do what I need to be a leader in change for housing justice. So I want to speak a bit about my weird role as a researcher because I'm feeling very ambivalent about it often. As a researcher, I'm really suspicious about research, particularly research that sits within these predetermined boxes of what research can do. I think often there's a narrative that if we just measure this enough, we'll have this outcome. Or if we look at this thing, if we just illuminate this one thing, we'll change housing injustice. And I think that I don't believe that's true. I don't know if other people do. But I think that there's something wherein we use research as a means to an end. We're going to get this end, and the means through which we do research doesn't actually matter. What I've heard speaking to lived experts is that is not the case. The methods that we use, the means we use to engage community knowledge is incredibly important. And so research can have a huge impact, and it has had an impact in my life. And so I want to give one example. When I was homeless, I absolutely thought that everything was my fault. I got kicked out of school. I was barred from mental health services. I was non-compliant with the programs that existed. And I individualized that. And it was only when I went back to school and I connected with researchers who supported me to understand that I saw that these were actually systems that were harming a lot of other young people experiencing homelessness. And through that support and that care, I was able to augment and bolster my research with my lived experience and bring in things that other people weren't seeing. But I was also able to bolster my lived experience with research. And those in conversation have allowed me to act as an advocate to change systems that harmed me and my peers. So I want us to think this week about the means that we use to the ends that we're hoping to see. The other thing that I hear again and again from people I'm working with, and people who know me will know that I say this like constantly, is that we have to build solidarity. I'm sure many of you know that charity models can really, again, objectify and hierarchize knowledges in ways that are really unjust. So the ways that we build solidarity, I think, are beginning in the idea that my survival is tied up in yours, that I don't want you to act on my behalf. And I, as a researcher, don't want to be acting on behalf of communities most impacted by housing injustice, but instead thinking through how we can build systems grounded in our shared survival. I would encourage us this week and in all of our lives to listen and learn in earnest, because I think something that happens when we're exhausted in these spaces is also that we come in and we go through the motions. And I think when we truly sit and learn from one another and do that with true listening, with showing up in the ways that we need to, we can build new ways of thinking about housing justice. Again, people who work with me probably hear this all the time. Naomi, I'm sorry. But I think that imagination is something that we're also really lacking in homelessness research. I hear this especially with the young people that I work with. Sometimes when you're homeless, having a radical imagination for a possibility of another world is a matter of survival. When you're seeing your communities die around you, when you're seeing suffering and you're seeing constant injustice in your everyday life, thinking of the ways and imagining ways that systems could look different is a way to continue each day. And it's a way to reject the inevitability that we are doing things the way we have done because we have always done them. It's a way to reject the inevitability that systems have to be based on white supremacy and colonialism and homophobia and transphobia and ableism and xenophobia. It's a way to reject the inevitability that the systems that we work in and we build together have to be unjust in some way, or that we can accept a little bit of injustice because some things are happening that are good. And so when I work with young people, I hear again and again that we have to be thinking beyond what we deem feasible and thinking together about new futures that we might not know what they look like yet. So I would encourage us also this week to not be thinking necessarily what can we do tomorrow, maybe also that, but also thinking of radical possibilities for new futures. And I think that we can each do this, no matter where we sit within our organizations or our communities, no matter how we enter spaces, we can change the way we do meetings. We can change the way we expect people to show up. We can change the way that we structure our organizations and what kinds of knowledges we valorize and listen to. And so I think that radical imagination is actually something we can bring into our practices, but we're often discouraged from doing because it's not seen as immediately applicable. Cool? Okay, we're in agreement. So that being said, here's all of the things that I think about on a daily basis. But what I really like to do is learn from people who are working in their communities, especially people with lived experience of homelessness. And so today I wanted to have a dialogue, and I'm so grateful that Rob is here to join me. We prepared some questions that we're going to ask each other, and then we're going to open it up to some questions from you folks. How does that sound? Okay. All right. Well, then I might come back here at some point, but I'm going to go.
So thank you, Jayne. It is an honor to sit next to you and be invited to a forum such as this. And Jayne and I, before this, had one conversation, and I'm a person that believes in synergy, and a fire ignited in that conversation that we had. And I said, we could do this and we could do it a little bit different. And so I'm so looking forward to this conversation. But I always like to take these opportunities to thank a bunch of people, because I got here based on a few people believing in me, and as Jayne spoke about, giving me voice. So first, thank you to everybody at DePaul, because I understand what it is to put events like this together. I'm on the board of a big conference that happens in New York called the Left Forum, where we've had as many as 5,000 people show up to Left Forum. So I understand the intensity behind putting together something like this. So thank you to everybody at DePaul. Thank you to the audience that is present here and the people that are online. It's cool that you took time out from your schedule to be here, and I'm appreciative of it. But I have two special thank yous that I want to do. One is to a professor some of you may know. His name is Neil Smith, may he rest in peace, was a distinguished professor of geography and anthropology at the City University of New York Graduate Center. And Neil heard me speak at Columbia University in 2007, and I made one statement that I think forever changed my life, and that was gentrification leads to displacement, which leads to homelessness, which leads to criminalization. And Neil Smith was in the audience and stood up and asked me to repeat it. And when I did, he approached the table at the end and asked me a question. Where did you find the time, or how did you come up with a theory like that? And I said, I was on the streets of Miami for 2.5 years, nothing else to do but think. So I might as well think of why this happened, right? So I came up with that. And Neil invited me to lunch, and from lunch, he invited me to lecture his students. And I looked at him and I said, I can't lecture graduate students. I have an undergraduate degree. And Neil looked at me, he put his grill, as the young folks say, right against my grill, and said, you taught me, you're going to teach my students. Just because you don't have a piece of paper that says you're a professor doesn't mean you don't have anything to share. If you have knowledge and you're willing to share that knowledge, you're a teacher. So it's with a lot of pride that I say Neil's students teach all over the United States today, and many of them bring me into their classrooms on a regular basis to lecture their students, you know, some 10, 11 years after Neil's death. So I'm appreciative of that. But the final appreciation goes to a group called the Institute for Global Homelessness. Lydia Stazen, excuse me, Tiffany Connolly, who's sitting in front of me, and Julia Wagner have elevated my profile in an international community to levels I never expected. And I think it started when they offered my name to a group called Data for the SDGs to do a presentation at the Ford Foundation. And that has sent me in so many different directions that my head is spinning, but I'm very appreciative of it, because I think they understood lifting up the voices of people with lived experience and put me front and center. So I'm grateful to the three of you for all that you've done. So thank you. Give them a round of applause. Don't be shy. So okay.
Okay. This is your question.
Okay. So yeah, so I think who is experiencing homelessness? So for me, I have an undergraduate degree from the University of Maryland. You see me walking with a cane. I went to Maryland on a college scholarship to play football. and broke my hip and pelvis my freshman year at the University of Maryland at College Park. But my dad, who wasn't well educated, when Jerry Claiborne, the coach, came to the house, my dad made Jerry Claiborne guarantee that I would get a 4-year ride even if I got hurt, because I had fractured my hip every year of high school and still got to the University of Maryland on a scholarship. So it was important that somebody in his family get an education at a pretty high level. So, I'm a college graduate, but I ended up working for a Fortune 500 company in the US called Automatic Data Processing. Worked my way up from taking small payrolls over the phone. If you know Automatic Data Processing, they're a payroll company. 80% of the payrolls produced in the world are produced by an automated system and are produced by ADP. I worked up from taking small payrolls over this phone to becoming a project manager overseeing a piece of software that ADP said would move it into the new millennium. It's called ADP Total Source. I got asked to move in 2001 from New York to Miami with relatively short notice. I moved within 2 weeks, moved down to Miami. ADP gave me a $10,000 relocation fee. They gave me a vehicle to drive for 3 months, and they put me up in a hotel for 3 months. So they sort of valued me at some point, right? But the 4th month after I got down there, they had no more use for me and told, there's no more money in the budget for your position. We're going to have to let you go. I found myself on the streets of Miami after exhausting my bank account, paying off a lease, exhausting 401k, spent 2.5 years on the streets of Miami. And that was a learning experience. I was down on the streets of Miami through 3 hurricanes, Hurricane Katrina, Rita, and Wilma. I spent on the streets and survived 3 hurricanes. And, found my way back to New York, spent 10 months in the New York City homeless shelter. But it was an experience that transformed me. So when you ask who was I, there's a lot of homeless people, and it was the narrative. This is important to me that brought me into organizing. You're homeless because you don't want to work. You're homeless because you don't have an education. You're homeless because you have a chemical or an alcohol addiction. You're homeless because you have mental illness. And I call that painting the issue with a broad brush. And I was like angry. Like, you're not effing touching me with that paintbrush. No way, right? And I'm going to be very vocal about it. I'm going to speak out and then encourage others to share their story and speak out. So I think that is who a lot of us are, people with lived experience. And, I'm happy to bring this experience and be involved in this conversation through this week. Got to turn it on. Should be on there.
Hello. Oh,
There you
hi.
go.
Yeah, thanks, Rob.
On.
When Rob proposed this question, I thought it was a really important one. I work in education now. A lot of my work looks at the right to education and the right to housing, because I was kicked out of high school while I was homeless as a young person. And when I was thinking of this question and the narratives that people have about homelessness, I was thinking of how many times I go into classrooms, as I'm sure you do, and I speak about youth homelessness, and I still hear from pre-service teachers and professionals and all kinds of folks that they didn't know that youth homelessness even existed. We hear this, about different kinds of hidden forms of homelessness as well. People just don't know that this is something that happens. And so when I look at someone like a teacher who may see something is wrong with a young person, but have no idea that homelessness might be one of those things because they have preconceived notions of who a homeless person is, I find that to be a great opportunity to change the narrative. And so thinking also of what I was sharing, I think that lived experiences and the ways that we share them can be incredibly transformational and can destigmatize and demystify. However, I think often the ways that they're brought in aren't full of care, and they can objectify. And so I think that this is a unique place where we can bring in narratives and research in tandem to educate people about what homelessness actually looks like in the lives of people.
Absolutely. Jayne, one of the things, and I like to do this work through a series of sharing stories. I've had some great experiences, and one of them that I'll share was with a high school student out in Idaho. So in 2011, I'm an intern at the human rights organization where I work, Partners for Dignity and Rights, got her advisor to invite me out to the University of Idaho in Moscow, Idaho, to do a presentation to the Human Rights Commission in Idaho and have a conversation about homelessness with different folks in Idaho. The very first conversation I had was a high school sociology class. And I shared my lived experience. And, as the class is over, it's about 45 minutes, whatever a high school class is, people are filing out. But I noticed one young lady like sort of hesitating to leave. And, folks are high-fiving me, thanking me, and, really appreciating what I shared. And this young lady, she's the last one in the class, and she hugs me and she whispers in my ear, me and my family slept in a trailer for 7 months, right out in the open. It was the first time she had shared that publicly. She had never told anybody, but she suddenly felt she was in a safe space. And when I told her teacher like, I had no idea. I said, well, yeah, she hadn't had the opportunity to share. She didn't feel comfortable in it. So hopefully there was some lessons learned behind that experience. I hope so. But I think so many people hold this stuff inside because they haven't experienced a safe space or a place where they're comfortable to be able to share those such stories. And I think that's it's a powerful way. Storytelling is a powerful way to get people to feel safe. Right. I came out of shelter in 2006. I'm sitting before you today. What is it? 16 years later, 17 years later, still sharing the story, right? Because storytelling is powerful.
What a wonderful segue to my next question. Yeah, I think that this is something that comes up again and again as well in my research and my work and sharing my own story. But I wonder if you can add on that or maybe think differently about this question. How can those most impacted by housing precarity be centered in building strong communities for housing justice?
I think so. First, they have to be giving a meaningful place at the table. And what do I mean by that? You could be at the table and have a voice and impact the conversation, or you could be at the table and be on the menu. And let me give you an example of that. In 2008, I get invited as this advocate who is really speaking out about homelessness and sharing his own experience, get invited to a conversation in New York City by Mayor Bloomberg, right? 3-term mayor of New York City, quote unquote, supposed to be progressive. He was going to reduce homelessness during his term by 30%, but it increased by 60% during his term, but that's another story. I get invited. There were 32 people around the table. And as I start to look at the faces at the table, I realized I'm the only person probably with lived experience. So before the meeting starts, I go, Mayor Bloomberg, did you ever sleep on a piece of cardboard? And he was like stunned. He looked at me and like, huh? I said, did you ever sleep on a piece of cardboard? And he goes, I don't understand the question. I said, well, there are 32 people around this table. And I'm probably the only one with experience of sleeping on cardboard. So I'm wondering how you guys are in good conscience are sitting at the table about to make decisions about homelessness when you've never experienced it. That meeting busted up. He called an end to that meeting after he got like as red as can be. He called the meeting, and about 6 months later when it reconvened, there were 16 people with lived experience and 16 people who were elected or appointed as elected officials in New York City. So given an opportunity to have a voice is important, but sometimes you just have to take it. And I think those voices coming into the conversation around participatory actions are important. So when I say participatory, I like to go into these meetings with the human rights framework. And I use 5 basic principles of human rights. The color taupe, beige, T-A-U-P-E, T for transparency. Those decisions that are created should be transparent. A for accountability. Somebody should be accountable, or some group should be accountable for those decisions. U for universality. They should work for all of us, whether I'm documented or undocumented, right? A big issue currently in New York City. P, participation. I have the right to participate in those decisions that are going to affect my life. And E, it should bring equity for all of us, right? So I think I'm organizing around this issue and bringing those voices of people impacted, but giving them the necessary tools to really have a meaningful voice at the table is important, right? And, it's an ongoing struggle, Jayne. It's not something that is going to happen right away. But again, I will, as people start to think about this and, people like you and myself who have gotten to a certain place in society that may give us a little more credibility. It sucks to say that, but that's the realism of it, right? Then it's incumbent upon us to promote those other voices. So you'll often hear me say in New York City, I have my foot in the door of City Hall, but I say to the community, I'm going to kick the door open and bring you all in.
I love that. Yeah, I have a follow-up question for you. I
Sure.
would also answer this, but I think one thing I really like that you're talking about, like giving people the support, right? Because I think one thing that I've found is the more stable my housing situation gets, the further away I get from lived experiences, I am definitely missing things that are happening today that weren't happening when I was a young person or when I was navigating homelessness. I wondered two things, like in your experience, have you found tools for like continuing to learn from people? And how do we structure those kinds of learning opportunities?
Yeah, this is a great question. I thank you for this. So I'm not putting Jayne on the spot here, but I'm going to put the social justice world in the US on the spot. And I believe that organizing has become professionalized in the US, right? I refuse to take a paycheck from a not-for-profit organization. I want to do the work that I do from here because I care, right? And I'm committed. So I'm a special advisor as a volunteer with Partners for Dignity and Rights since 2009. I haven't received a penny from him, and I refuse to take money from him. So people will say to you, okay, so how do you sustain yourself? Everybody needs money to live. Okay, so I have a disability. I work for ADP, so I get a government pension because I have a disability, a pretty good pension, better than a lot of homeless people in the US. Then I speak at all these universities, I get an honorarium. So I have a way of sustaining myself that is a lot different from other people. But I also think it's important that we recognize that I don't want to say wrong, but I think there's something different when you do it from the heart, right? You care. Right? I could have easily backed away. I show up at a lot of meetings. One of the reasons why I have a lanyard around my neck is because I usually have a New York City subway pass where I go from meeting to meeting to meeting, and people scratch their heads. How the F do you go to all of those meetings? Well, I plot my time out. There's 24 hours in a day. 12 of them I'm going to work. So what can I do in those 12 hours that is meaningful? And I don't criticize anybody for doing it a different way. It's the way I prefer to do the work. So I put myself in a lot of spaces. I put myself in spaces, particularly something that is passionate with Jayne, with young folks, because I need to understand youth homelessness in a better way, because my voice has a lot of weight in some elected officials' way. Okay, bring that voice into those bodies, but then kick the door open and bring the people directly impacted into those spaces. So I think it's a lot of things. It's a combination of things that helps me get to that place. But again, I don't want to beat up on anybody, but I just refuse to take money from a not-for-profit organization, and it's allowed me to do this work, I think, in a different way.
Thanks, Rob. I have taken money from nonprofit organizations.
Listen, Jayne, we all need to survive. And you know what? So one of the things I say, and I don't know if you guys are familiar with the electric company in New York, I always say, when I make a statement like this, I understand the not-for-profit organizations, they have a staff and they got to pay Con Ed, right? Like I get it. They got bills to pay. I totally get it, right? So I just, I don't want to target anybody. Everybody has to do what they have to do to survive. I get this, I get it, but it's the way I personally feel. And I've been able to navigate spaces a little bit differently than others. And I call it privilege. This is one thing I say. I'm very clear about that. People will look at me. Are you saying you're privileged? I'm effing privileged because I don't have to take the dollar from the not-for-profit organization, right? I can do this work in a different way. So understanding that privilege is important too.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And as someone who's in a place where I can do some of that, I think there's some kind of political ideology that says to each according to their means.
That's right.
something
There you
like
go.
that.
However that goes, right? Like,
But I think, and I think that's why it's also important to have different people with different lived experiences who are also in different roles and bringing in different professional learnings, because that ensures that there's a diversity of voices, that some people can use their privilege to access those spaces differently. And it also outlines the role of allies. How can they use access and privilege to support
right.
people as well? And so this was kind of a mix of two of our questions that I think gets at this as well. How can we understand homelessness as a societal problem? So maybe thinking of those individual participations and choices versus thinking of our societal obligation around homelessness, but also how can we be learning across these different experiences, which I think is what we're hoping to do this week. Those are two very big questions. But in my experience, I think that there has to be a diversity of ways of engaging. And so I do think that there's ways of sustaining engagement. And I think that the ways that lived experiences often engage with is, like you said, without transparency and accountability, but also sometimes without appropriate compensation, particularly in research where it might really be frowned upon for giving too much money to someone with lived experience. And so I wonder too about how you've navigated these and learning about how to think of our societal obligation.
So I want to tackle the first part because I think I have a couple of different answers to that. So the societal issue is, for me, I'm blessed again to have a relationship with academia that some people may think is damaging. Every Friday morning in New York, I have coffee with a progressive economist by the name of Richard Wolff. Right? Richard Wolff, if you know him, is on national radio and television doing a program called Economic Update. He's been very influential in my thinking. We have a lot of synergy together. We sit and solve the problems of the world every Friday morning. That's an experience not everybody gets. And I'm blessed to have that experience. And if, like this week while I'm traveling, I'm away, I get messages from him. I'm kind of upset that we're not meeting. Can we do it over Zoom, right? So it's been important to him. But, he's helped me understand economics, understand capitalism. One of Neil Smith's professors was David Harvey, the Marxist theorist in New York. I've sat in David Harvey's classes many a semester. He's influenced my thinking and understanding the economic system that we run on in this world and how it affects the lives of people has been important. That could be a lot for a lot of people going through lived experience. Yeah, Jayne and I are blessed a little bit because we have an education level that is different than a lot of people with lived experience, but how we apply that, I think, is important. So, I've applied it in many ways, Jayne, and understanding that this is a societal issue. It's come through the economic issue, but often, how do you relay that? So, story time. 2009, I get to go to Budapest, Hungary, with a student who was following the organization that I was involved in, Picture the Homeless in New York. She wanted to start an organization like that in Hungary. And she said, well, she got a grant from the Davis Peace Foundation and invited 4 of us over for a 20-day stay. And near the end of the trip, I got to spend some time in a seaside community called Zaget. And our very last forum was to a group in Zaget. It's a seaside community. And I opened up the forum explaining that this is a societal issue, some of the obstacles and some of the things that causes homelessness. And there was a man in the audience who the translator said in my earpiece as I'm speaking, "What? And for 51 years, I'm blaming myself. Now this guy says it's not my fault." He had been on the streets of Zaget for 51 years since he was in diapers, he said, homeless, and he was carrying that weight on his shoulder that he was a failure. And here's this guy from the other side of the world saying, I'm not a failure, right? It's a societal issue, and we need to look at this as a society. And being able to influence somebody's thinking like that is an image that forever sticks in my mind. But the better image from that conversation was Zoltan, who was the gentleman's name, coming up to me after that event and just holding me and squeezing me for about 5 or 6 minutes and shaking because the weight of the world had come off his shoulders. Somebody said, this isn't your fault. It's not an individual issue. So it's something that I've always taken with me and tried to share that. And the very next day I walked in the room, and as soon as he made eye contact, he came right up to me and started squeezing and shaking again. So I think, when you talk about how can we understand the experiences, I've been blessed to travel. Some of you may know I just returned from India. I was in India earlier this month at the invitation of Caitlin Schwan, who has a relationship with Jayne. We just found out a little while ago. Caitlin used to work for UN Special Rapporteur Leilani Farhar, and she had done this thing about the right to health care for street homeless people, and the Street Institute invited her to India, and she in turn invited me to India, and just to sit down with folks there to learn of struggles from the different countries. South Africa was in the room. Ireland was in the room. The US was in the room. So being able to be in these spaces where you're allowed to share experiences, I think was important. And it'll speak to something that I think will come up later in a question that Jayne and I discussed, what people sometimes salivate for, and you have to be careful. So I think the experiences across the globe are important. What is happening here this week is important. I'm already seeing faces that I've been on Zoom with, which is pretty cool. Now you're in the room with those people. You just heard an invite to come up and say hello to folks. So I will make my way and make the invite and say hello. But I think it's important that we start to share those experiences with one another. I know there's a big contingent from Canada. I've been up to Canada a few times for the Canadian Conference to End Homelessness, and did a presentation on data collection, right? Which was important, which helped me learn a lot about collecting data on homeless issues, right? So I think the international experience is strong, and, sharing what are the cultural divides, what are social divides that prevent us from sharing information. At the end of the day, we're all going through the shit for the same reasons, right? It's the same cause and effect across the globe, but we need to come together and stop separating ourselves. So, I'm always down to organize globally.
Me too. Thank you, Rob. I think these are such important points, especially around marrying research and lived experience to really have those understandings. And I've had those moments where I'm like, oh, this wasn't my fault. And here's how we can collectively organize together.
That's right.
But also, thinking of, I guess, just how exhausted everyone might be. I know I have been in the last couple of years, that we can depend on one another to do this work. And actually, if we don't depend on one another, we can't accomplish this work. And so I think there's something about the labor we put in together as well. I have one more question for you, Rob. What is an urgent issue for housing justice that you want to highlight for those attending this week?
So I'm going to speak from the U.S. point of view on this question, right? The reason this is an issue of poverty in the U.S., right? Poverty is something that has never been addressed. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King both took bullets at the end of their life because they were taking this issue to the United Nations in Geneva. But we still, as the wealthiest country, have refused to address poverty. And in a city like the city where I come from, where the average rent for an apartment in Manhattan is close to $5,000 a month, poor people can't afford that, man. Right? That's realistic. Working people can't afford it. There are working people in shelters in New York City. There are working people living without shelter in New York City. It's absurd. And on top of that, to build in New York City, land has become so expensive that air is for sale. Let me repeat that. Air is for sale. You will go out of your way to try to find a one-story building in New York. You know why? Because it's probably zoned for 50 stories up. So great story. Down the street from Partners for Dignity and Rights, where we used to have an office, was a 10-story garage near the South Street Seaport. And people would come off the seaport and watch these cars go up on an elevator. It was like a tourist attraction to watch these cars go up to the 8th floor to be parked, right? All of a sudden, somebody comes along and says, you know what? This parking garage, this area is zoned for 54 stories. If I put a condo building up here and sell condos for $1 million, I could make a fortune. He offered the guy $62 million for his parking garage. That parking garage was gone and the building was constructed in less than a year, man. Right? It's amazing how fast that goes up. But honestly, to get back to the real root of the story, people in this country or in the US are going to have to, at some point, look poverty in the eye and figure it out. The Nordic countries have figured it out in many ways. We need to learn from this. We need sustainable wages in this country, which we don't have. We're used to abusing labor in this country, which is why manufacturing jobs left, right? It used to be the backbone of our economy. But all of a sudden, if I have to pay, the International Garment Workers Union $22 an hour, or I could ship it to Sri Lanka and get it put together for $3 an hour, I'm shipping out these goods to Sri Lanka and bringing it back because I'm all about profit. And profit is like a drug. I'm never satisfied. The more I make, the more I want, right? It's something that we have to understand. This is why you have to understand the economics of this country and how capitalism actually works.
Thanks, Rob. I would agree. I think I would add that, again, thinking of changing the way we're doing things, not doing things in the same way just because that's what we know.
That's right.
I think that we can't address housing injustice on stolen land. We can't address housing injustice
Right.
when housing is seen as a commodity. And so really, if we're making changes, ensuring that those changes address these systems that are in place that ensure that people are necessarily homeless. And so I think coming in and maybe being open to thinking of things differently, or maybe you're already thinking of
Well,
things
let me share with you, Jayne, where I think we take a misstep. And again, I'm going to bring you from a New York City perspective, and it has to do with research. I shared the story with Jayne earlier. So I was reached out to by the London School of Economics professor and a PhD student as somebody with lived experience, and they're doing research on homelessness in the 90s in London versus New York City and the welfare hotels of New York City. So my job as a research assistant is to go to the municipal archives of New York City and to gather information on this. And as I'm reading through this stuff, and I'm realizing New York City is doing the same shit 30 years that they did 30 years ago, and it didn't work. Now I have ammunition to go with New York City at a level they never expected, because I'm bringing back, city council hearing information, right? All the stuff you guys discuss, and you still, if you keep doing it the same way over and over again, it's the definition of insanity. Stop it already. We have to think outside of the box. So, I think we're back to challenging the way we do things, and we have to think outside of the box. And I think that's part of the issue with respect to housing, particularly in New York City and other places around the US, right? Not thinking differently, right? So.
Yeah, I agree with that. And in my research right now, I've spoken with people with lived experience who've been advocates in housing for decades. And they're like, we did this and then we forgot about it, or the organization got defunded, or this happened. And so I think there's this memory piece, both in policies and in documents, but also in actions that we can draw from and act from there. We would like to open the floor to questions.
I want to, before we do that, Jayne, I want to throw something. Maybe this will spark something in the audience, right? So I know there are people from around the world here, right? And New York City is a model to a lot of folks because we have a quote unquote right to shelter law, right? So that New York City right to shelter law has created some 600 shelters in New York City, where anywhere from 60 to 75,000 people are in those shelters on a given day. The numbers were increased a little bit by the influx of migrants from other countries and that thing that we've gone through the last month. But I would caution folks, many people as I travel around the world will say to me, well, we want shelters. Do you? Because the average length of stay in those 600 shelters in New York City, 500 days. So we're not getting to housing people, right? There's a housing problem in New York City, and it's caused a backup within our shelter system. So I leave you with that little tidbit, hoping that when you think about a right to shelter law, which is also confused with a right to housing law in New York City, not the same, folks, distinctly different. They are mutually exclusive. I think it's something for you to think about. It's a huge, huge problem in New York City, as far as I'm concerned. But then I will get social workers thinking that I'm attacking their livelihood. Be clear. I never said we don't need social workers. What I am saying is we need them in a different setting.
Yeah, agreed. Thanks, Rob.
So it's your turn. Come at us. Disagree with us, right?
Hello, I'm Andrew. I'm a case manager at a social services agency here in Chicago. Thanks you both for being here. You mentioned fostering radical imagination, and it's something I think is incredibly critical to me and I think my colleagues being able to do the work we do. But I can imagine that looks really different for a service provider than it does for someone in research or people who have lived experience. And so I'm curious if you could share a little bit about more of that for yourselves, and then also if you're seeing things that are coming up a lot in research, like when you talk, especially to young people, are any of those imaginations kind of trickling together?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. I think what it makes me think of immediately is also back to our conversation about privilege. I think as a researcher, at least at this point in my career, I have a lot of flexibility with what I can do and how I can work with young people that I think service providers and social workers and people who are doing that support don't have. I can show up in different ways. I mean, I've had projects where I'm literally like, I don't know, doing everything that I can, crossing boundaries that I shouldn't be crossing, doing things differently because we have conversations about, well, this is what this typically looks like, but can we do it differently? Can we show up for young people differently? And can we actively create new ways of connecting today? I think the ways that research supports this can be kind of in a bubble. And so I've had projects that I worked on with people in this room where we have these moments where we create connections and those are impactful. And I think that it's important to recognize those as research impacts, the ways that we relate to one another. However, they're not sustainable in a way that perhaps a program might be or might not be, depending on your funding. But I think that there's ways that research can offer these spaces to imagine things differently that I don't think we always take up. I think that there's narrow ways of thinking of how research can impact social change. I would say also, working with young people who are navigating homelessness, it's very different on a day-to-day basis because we would have meetings where it would be like, okay, we're going to tackle white supremacy. This is the thing that needs to end. And this research has to address that some way. And then like the next week, they'd be like, actually, no, we just want, social assistance to be augmented. And those aren't unrelated. However, the ways that they were imagining it impacting their day-to-day lives would change. And so I think that's also a place where researchers who might have some of that labor and that they can do to pull all of those things together can actually put radical imagination in motion in ways that perhaps people who have institutional constraints can't, maybe not. But I also think working with young people and adults, like having a worker who breaks the rules is the number one thing that I hear that helps people. Like legit, every project, every person I work with, the rules aren't often there to protect the people that are being served.
So speaking on, you may not call it breaking the rules, but doing the work outside of the box. So back to Hungary. During that same visit, there were 16 people living in a forest in Budapest, and they called it Sherwood Forest. And there were 3 social workers that would come out there on a regular basis to have conversations with them. And one night when we were there, big pot of stew, some wine and some beer, and we just talked through a lot of stuff. And it was enlightening to learn about a year later that all 16 of those folks were housed, right? But it was social workers who took it upon themselves to not do it the clinical way, to do it a little bit differently. And I am often asked to speak to the CUNY School of Social Work or City University School of Social Work and to Columbia School of Social Work. And I always end those conversations by, I know you were taught a certain way as you went through this program, but try to apply your trade thinking a little bit outside of the box. And I share the examples of Hungary and some other places where I've seen it done a little bit differently, right? As Jayne said, breaking the rules somewhat, right? Meeting. I'm not a big fan of the statement, but I do think it's pertinent to young folks because their experience is different, meeting people where they're at. When it comes to adults, I'm not a big believer in that statement because I will say to you, they're all over the place. How are you going to get anything done? But I think the experience of young people is quite different, right? So.
Question from the Zoom. So the first one is, why is homelessness or being homelessness not my fault?
Oh, you want to take that one first?
Why? Because we have a country that puts a value on wealth, right? So we don't tax the rich. We allow poor people to fend for themselves and saying it's your fault that you can't progress in this country, but we never acknowledge the obstacles that are put in the way of people progressing, right? What are those things that were put before me that prevent me from progressing or achieving certain goals? And I think that's what we have to look at. We have to stop making this an individual issue and start to look at this issue as a country. When 40% of the wealth is possessed by 1% of the population in this country, Houston, we have a problem, right? So how do we redistribute wealth? Again, I'm back to the Nordic country. You know, you have a minimum standard of living. If your family only brings in $16,000 a year, and we say the minimum standard of living is $21,000, your family gets a $5,000 check. I mean, there are ways. We saw during the pandemic. I mean, listen, I'm not destitute. I'm also not wealthy, but I got a couple of checks during the pandemic. Probably I didn't really need. And I bet you a whole bunch of other people didn't need them. People who with more income than me. So we have the means to redistribute wealth in some ways. Do we have the political will to do it? And I think that goes a long way to answering that question.
I would also add, yes, redistributing wealth, totally on board with that. But I think it's a tricky question because I also don't want to shift how people are thinking of their own trajectories, and I don't want to take away agency. But I think that when we look at the systems that maintain this inequality, there's education systems, there's healthcare, mental health care, there's legal systems for sure, criminal justice, but there's normative ideas of who is being served in those systems. And so what happens when you are in a system and you aren't the idea of who that young person or adult is, you're often stuck making a choice between a crappy option and another crappy option. And so I think you might have agency and choice, but those choices are not set up for you to succeed or thrive. And so I think that there's ways we can hold on to our agency and the choices we make and our accountability to our communities while also recognizing that the system is set up for us to fail.
That's right.
Some of us. I see many hands.
I've got a microphone. So,
So
my
I've
name's
got power.
John. I know the power. My name's John. I work with an organization called U-Turn in Cape Town, South Africa.
Ooh.
So don't be jealous. No. So my question, and it's something you mentioned there, Rob, about New York and shelter. In Cape Town, we find that the policymakers, the local government, and donors often always want to look at activity. How many people have you done this, and this to? But no one's looking at outcomes. Like, is what we're doing actually working? Sounds like there's something similar happening in New York. How, in your opinion, Jayne and Rob, do you change this?
This is difficult. So just a picture of New York. So there is a certain 2 pots of money that are directed towards homelessness in New York City. One is through the municipal government. The Department of Homeless Services has a budget of about $1.75 billion a year to support those temporary shelters. Then there's a small pot of money called McKinney-Vento funding that comes in from our federal government and Housing and Urban Development to the tune of $150 million. So that is for Shelter Plus Services. I served on that committee, which is a continuum of care. To receive that money, you have to set up something called the continuum of care for 13 years. And I went in as a lived experience person, starting to ask a bunch of questions. And it was why Care Provider A says it takes $25,000 a year to provide this service to that person. Care Provider B delivers the same package of services, but says it's $45,000. So I started to ask questions, and then I started to get people with a little more power than me to ask questions because everybody was uncomfortable in the room that this voice is suddenly speaking up and understanding. But it was some of the power in the room that educated me on how the process worked. So I think that pot of money we started to really dig in deep on and try to get the best value of it. So it was a small group of committed individuals that worked together and maximized that money that was coming out of HUD, because it was a competition, right? You're in competition for that $150 million, and we want to hit the top every year on that. So I think following the lead of those small groups of people that are dedicated towards it was a way forward for us. And now, I mentioned data before. Data is the way that I think that we can get a hold on it. And it's something that I'm working with IJOH to really think through globally. But having a system across the globe where we can collect data is going to start to help us get to that point. Not going to be easy. It's going to take time. But as you start to see data, data reveals trends, and trends reveal issues, and issues need to be resolved.
Yeah, I would just add, I think on a little bit of a different note, the things that I hear from people that are most impactful to them are not necessarily the things that are considered in evaluation. So like, how do you measure talking to someone who gets you? Like, how do you measure having a sense of community and connection? I think that there's things that get lost when we are thinking of data in a particular way. And I think that data is important, but I think we need to be drawing on community knowledges for that as well.
I think I'll just add quickly, I see a lot of hands. This thing about data, in many instances in community, we see data as surveillance. So it's been a work in progress to try to educate folks in our community that data can be used to support your arguments. And that's changed. That's a cultural shift. That's not so easy to do, but that's a conversation. I'm blessed to work with two groups of young folks in New York, the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project and the Housing Data Coalition, which are young folks with technical skills who go into something called the New York City Open Data Portal and extract information and work with community groups to say, what do you need from this information that we've extracted, and how can we organize it in a way that's useful to your group and to your agenda? And I think that's been huge for us in New York City.
Super cool.
Yeah, there are a bunch of hands up, so poor Julia.
Hi, my name is Ashley. I'm from Sertoma Center. So I'm a peer support specialist. Me and my supervisor, Ashley, are here today. So we go out every day on a mobile crisis unit and we help people who are experiencing homelessness. And I feel the question I have is, people are so concerned about finding where they're going to lay their head that they look over, they need mental health services, they need substance abuse services. How do we get our consumers to see that they need other things? They're in survival mode. So how do we help them with the other stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. And also gets at like, is it housing? Is it everything? Like, how interrelated are these things? But I think that what I've heard again and thinking of that connection piece is like, if they have somewhere where they can at least connect with someone, and maybe it's a peer support worker, often I think it is a peer support worker or an outreach worker, where they can say, I need to figure my housing out, but also at the same time have a conversation about like how you're doing and what's going on in your life. Those seem to be those moments where something is facilitated because someone is talking to you and treating you like a human being. And so I think it is this tricky question of like, is it housing? Yes. Is it also all of those other things? Yes. But it is also importantly a lack of connection and like lack of feeling like you're worthy of support.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, I agree with everything Jayne said, but I will promote a model in here. I'm a big believer in housing first. I think knowing the old mechanisms, right? You have to get clean before you come in here. You have to do this, or you have to go into this program. It's a lot of bullshit, right? Bring the people in, give them a place to lay their head and show them some respect. And let's start working together to get them to change, right? And to give them the opportunities that they seek, right? And that comes from building trust and relationships. And that's an important part of this process.
Yeah.
You know, you talked a while ago about poverty being the key issue. And I'm thinking about those systemic issues of poverty. How do you break those things that feed that, like greed and, you know, the white people want to be in control or whatever it is, those things that fuel that? How do we deal with that?
Go ahead.
I mean, I think that the way we deal with that is education.
I knew we had synergy there. That's,
Yeah.
I feel the same way. So.
Because I think there's always the idea that, humans are inherently greedy and will always kind of trample on each other to get ahead. But I think that that's a learned behavior. I think that the way our education system is set up, and part of why I think a lot of youth who are navigating homelessness don't find school helpful, is because they're being trained to think in a certain way, and they're being trained to act in a certain way towards their communities that are not grounded in care. And so I think if we change the way we approach education, both in terms of fostering other ways of connecting, but also in like understanding that students are also navigating a lot, including housing precarity, that can be really impactful for creating communities that don't have those inherent values.
So story time with Rob. I call what I experienced being homeless a transformation, right? So when I came out of shelter in 2006, I came out transformed, right? The world needs to change. I changed. And what I was taught the first half of my life, brain dump, right? And you need to learn the world all over again. I started reading, started learning. Education was the foundation for me, trying to understand this term that I heard in Miami when I was on the streets, gentrification. Then I heard the same word in New York City. Spent a lot of my time, early days after coming out of shelter, in libraries, reading and studying. So I'm a big believer in education. It transformed me. I often say I wish I had a magic wand where I could go by and tap people on the head and they automatically get transformed. I wouldn't cast aspersions on anybody that they should lay on the streets of Miami for 2.5 years and 10 months in a homeless shelter to go through this transformation. But if there's a way to do it, I think it's cool. And I think education, I agree so much with Jayne. And, a lot of us push back on education. And I should learn till I go to my grave, right? Realistically. And hopefully other people start to think that way. And I think we'll be better before. But the questions you answer fundamentally, we have to challenge people in power, right? Like, again, I mentioned earlier, learning about our economic system. Our economic system is based on greed and profit, right? And understand the role of workers in society and the material salvation for things, right? So this is something that David Harvey taught me, that we keep going and buying shit. Right. And as long as we do it, capitalism is functioning. Right. If you lose that salvation for material stuff, things change. I don't have the same interests. I used to come up out of Penn Station in New York on my way home from work from ADP and see the Macy's department store and want to go in and get a new suit because I once won an award, the best dressed guy at ADP. Who gives a shit about that now? Like who cares? Right. Like, I'm not spending my money on that. So I think, I agree, and I did it in a dramatic way, but I think education is so much a part of this. And, we have to be willing to learn and share knowledge, right? We have to share knowledge. I think we all have knowledge if we're willing to share. As Neil Smith said, you're a teacher. So, I challenge everybody to share knowledge.
I'm just entering my best dressed phase, I think. So I'll keep buying.
Hi, I'm Kristen, and I'm unhoused, and I'm also a master's in public health in Seattle, Washington. And how would you suggest that I begin working on my city on seeing homelessness and human rights as going together? Because I come from a community that really feels that my unhoused neighbors have zero human rights. So where would you suggest I possibly begin in that?
University of Seattle.
University of Washington.
No, I'm trying to think. But I'm thinking of somebody I know. I just blank with her name right now, but she's a human rights advocate I've worked with for years. Very powerful. I believe I will come up with the name. Please approach me. I will find the name. But I just got contacted about the sweep under the bridge there. Folks were asking me in the National Law Center to get involved. So I think it's important that we again share our stories with one another so that we can get support. I believe support coming from the other side of the country is very powerful, right? We're focused on this issue in Seattle, right? But we should definitely meet, seek me out. I'm going to be around here the rest of the week, so seek me out. Yeah, 5 minutes.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good strategy. Dr. Rob.
Okay, so unfortunately, we got to bring it to an end. I will let Jayne close us out, but I want to thank Jayne for the wonderful opportunity to sit next to her. Never saw myself as a researcher, but I understand the importance of it. And now I know I have one that I can understand this work a little bit better from. You know, I'm tasked with this job. You know, it is a job with the London School of Economics, but it is benefiting me in a way that I can call New York City out in a way that I never expected, right? Because I'm doing research that looks back at 30 years or 40 years of history and saying, okay, you haven't made a change. So I really appreciate the research and the opportunity to sit next to you here and learn from you. And the one thing I take away from panels like this is contact information. Jayne will get an email from me saying it was great to be next to you, and you know, and the relationship continues from there. So really appreciate being here.
Thank you
next to
so much, Rob. I'm so grateful for you to join me and learn from you. Thank you so much for inviting me. You can also come and say hi to me at any point this week. I would love to chat more. Thank you all for listening and for your questions. Thanks, Lydia. And you can email me too if you're tired of the
What a start. I cannot think of a better way to start off our 2.5 days together than with a conversation that elevates the importance of the knowledge and expertise of people who have experienced homelessness. The provost of DePaul University said it very well in her remarks that they are the true experts on this issue, and we are here to learn and share from and with them as well. So a couple of housekeeping notes before we go into our kind of breakout. So we have a half an hour break, and then our first session of breakouts will start. There are 4 different sessions to choose from. The session in this room will have interpretation support. So if you need interpretation, stay for the breakout in this room. But there are 3 other excellent sessions happening as well. Those will be on the 3rd floor of this building, and volunteers are standing by to help direct you to the rooms. Some of them are a little bit tucked away or hidden, so we have half an hour to figure out where we're going. If you are a presenter at the next session, please go directly to your breakout room, and the volunteers there will help you get your slides ready, make sure the tech is working, all of that. We have a cocktail hour back in this room at 4:45. So after that breakout, you're welcome back here. We'll be in the back of the room. We have a student musician group that's going to come and provide some ambiance for us. So we'll get the chance to just, you know, talk and share with each other. We have poster presentations at the back of the room. They'll be there all week long. We have local agencies that have done posters. We have students that have done posters on their research, and I think some professors as well. So take a look at those posters, learn from them. If you have the lived experience of homelessness, we have a separate lounge area for you as a retreat during these 2.5 days. That's on the 2nd floor of the conference center, kind of in the back of the cafeteria. Again, ask a volunteer if you need directions on heading there. Again, please use the hashtags and tweet. It's just Abe and I on Twitter right now. And we've talked way too much the last 6 months, so we don't need another channel to do that. So join us as you're hearing those snippets and nuggets. I mean, Rob said several things, and Jayne as well, that just kind of struck my heart. So be tweeting those, be sharing those out with the world beyond. And one thing Abe whispered to me is this conference has the spirit of radical imagination in it. When we think about homelessness, not just as a local issue, not just as a national issue, but as a global issue, that's radical imagination, and the power and the knowledge and the networks in this room and online as well have the power to make change for our global neighbors. So I love that question that Jayne and Rob had asked us. What is an urgent issue for housing justice that you want to highlight for those attending this week? So let's carry that question with us as we are connecting with people, as we're at the cocktail hour and not sure how to start the small talk. Ask that question because I think we will learn through those conversations that the themes and the challenges, regardless of our context, are more similar than they are different. And we can all work together on creating the change that we desperately need to see in this world on this issue. So with that, you're off to your half-hour breakout. We start again promptly at 3 p.m. Thank you.